Hey everyone, it's the Tyrant here, and welcome back to the channel, as well as the rantings and ramblings of an old man. Today I'd like to talk to you about Halo Infinite. Back in December of 2021, I posted my official review for the game. And for those of you who have not seen it yet, I'll post a link in the description below if you want to reference it, but I'll give you the bullet points here. When I posted my review, I had had the game for about a week, and so I gave you my initial thoughts, and for the most part, they were pretty positive. I did enjoy the game, and just to lay it out here, one of the things I said was, or a couple of things I said, was that the game did feel that it was unfinished, even more so than Halo 5 back when it first came out. But, having said that, it did lay an excellent foundation for the future of the game. So, at the time, of course, we didn't have any co-op, we didn't have replayable missions, and we didn't have Forge. A lot of stuff felt missing. The multiplayer even felt lacking. And that also includes customization, which I won't even go into that here, but I did say at the end of the video that because the game felt unfinished, but that it did lay an excellent foundation for a perfect Halo game, that I would post an update. And so that was about 15 months ago, a little over that now. Another thing that I did at the end of that video was give it a pending ranking in my Halo rankings list. And of course, if you haven't seen this already, I have an official ranking, an official Tyrant ranking of all of the mainstream Halo games. There is a video that essentially compiles them all on this channel. I'll post a link to that in the description below as well. And I'll just, for fun, I'll go ahead and post it right here on the left-hand side so you can see at the time of Halo Infinite how I ranked all of the major Halo games. This, of course, omits the Halo Wars games, as well as the Spartan Assault and Spartan Strike games. And looking at that list, I know what some of you are probably thinking. He has Halo 2 at the bottom. I cannot trust this man. Well, let me tell you, first of all, I am not a Halo noob. I did not come into the franchise when 343 took over or anything like that. I have been a Halo fan for over 20 years. I first started playing Halo back in 2002, about 7 months after Combat Evolved first came out. I have been a huge Halo fan ever since. To add to that, I have always stood by my rankings of Halo games. All the opinions that I share in those videos, and more so in that compilation video, again, link in the description below, I have largely stood by those over the years. And so this is why I sort of wanted to address Halo Infinite today, because this is the first time I've sort of pivoted on an initial review. Now, again, what I said in that Halo Infinite review video, the initial one, and again, this one's, if you can't tell already, is a bit more off the cuff than that one, is that ranking was pending, and it could go anywhere. I might move it up the list. I might move it down the list. It might stay right where it is. So where is it now? So first of all, they have added quite a few things since its release, but did it make it a better Halo game? Well, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And I'm going to try to go in a little bit more detail here. If you've been keeping up with the channel, you know that I've been a bit more persistent recently on cranking out videos for my Halo Infinite Legendary walkthrough. Yes, I know these are late. It was the same case with Halo 5. Lots been going on over the last year, including becoming a dad. So it's been keeping me busy. I just haven't had time to get them out as fast as I want to. But what this did do for me is get more into the grit of the game itself and look at it from a new angle. And so one of the things that I sort of wanted to point out right away that I didn't really catch the first time would be the enemies in the game as well as the factions. In pretty much every Halo game we've had up until this point, well, not every. This doesn't exclude ODST and Reach. We've had multiple factions in Halo games, and what this typically led to was having faction wars. Now, we saw this the most in Halo Combat Evolved. I don't think we've had a mission since the mission Keys, where we've seen such a huge Team AI versus Team AI conflict. We've seen it in bits and pieces in Halo 2 and Halo 3. We saw it a little bit in Halo 4, and again in Halo 5 between the Covenant and the Prometheans. Obviously in the Bungie days it was between the Covenant and the Flood. There is none of that in Halo Infinite at all. And again, it didn't really strike me at first, but when I've been going back through these missions on Legendary, there are currently 2 factions in the game, the Banished being one of them, obviously, and the other faction being the Sentinels. And this is probably a plot device. Maybe the Sentinels are being controlled by the Harbinger, who is currently working with Escharum and the Banished, and so, they're on each other's side, but they team up. And in my eyes, it made it a lot more boring. It goes back to what one of the things that Halo Combat Evolved, or what made the game stand apart and why I was drawn to it, as opposed to previous shooters that I played like Doom and Quake and GoldenEye and games like that, was because not only did you have Marines on your side most of the time, which you do in Infinite, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, but that's only some of the time. The rest of the time, when it's just you, it's you versus the world, just like all those other shooters out there. So I felt like Halo Infinite sort of lost its identity in that remark. When you're going into missions that feature both the Banished and the Sentinels, they're fighting side by side when I feel like they shouldn't be. One thing that I pointed out in my Halo Suggestions video, and again, I'll get more into that later and post a link to this video in the description below as well. And I'm sorry I'm giving you homework here, but this is in case you really want to go down deep into the rabbit hole. At least you have options. One of the suggestions that I made was faction conflicts, adding additional factions like the Flood and the Prometheans in additional campaign DLC to keep things interesting. And you don't really see that here. I think the Sentinels and the Sentinels and the Banished would have been great enemies in the latter half of the game. They aren't here, but to sort of add to that, one of the things I said in that video was that the Harbinger and the concept of the Harbinger and the Endless, maybe the Endless could have been hinted at, but the core game, Halo Infinite, should have stopped after the House of Reckoning. The Silent Auditorium felt like it was sort of tacked on at the end. It didn't really belong. And because they sort of looped in the Harbinger storyline, that's, in my eyes, probably why the Sentinels and the Banished sort of team up. Which, again, takes away from the fun of the game, or at least part of the fun for me, in terms of what I've enjoyed about Halo in the past. If they had added the Harbinger and tied that into the Banished later, along with the Sentinels, I could understand a little bit more. And it probably would have fit better, but because they did that here, it took away 2 things. One, what could have been a really well-rounded story ending with the death of Escharum was essentially just added on and sort of added a cliffhanger onto the game. And again, I'll get into the story in a little bit too. But it also felt like it added less variations in combat. So one of the things that I actually appreciated about Infinite is that while drones aren't in the game, they sort of replace them with skimmers. I do appreciate the skimmer dynamic versus drone dynamic from previous Halo games, and that you now have aerial enemies that aren't swarming you, they aren't bringing the game to a complete stop while you're just sitting there taking them out one by one. They do add a bit of variation to the fight in that they add some aerial support. But now that you factor the Sentinels in as well, and the Sentinels also use shock weapons, or at least some of them do, it doesn't really make the skimmers seem really that special anymore, because now you have 2 to 3 other flying variants out there. You have at least 2 Sentinel variants. You have the standard Sentinels, You have the shock rifle sentinels. I don't know if they're technically constructors or not, or if it's a different variant altogether. And you also have the shielded sentinels that usually have the heat wave. But again, now you basically just have 4 flying enemies, and because they're all against you and not against each other, it just sort of takes something away from that. So, at least in my eyes there, that's one thing that I would have changed and could have been done. And I'm going to again reference what I would have added in to Halo Infinite here. If they had added in different factions with additional campaign DLC, such as the Flood, the Prometheans, and so on, and maybe even the Endless too, since we hear about them in the core campaign but don't actually see them, they could have added more faction wars, and that would have made things a lot more interesting and entertaining. So now that I've talked a little bit about what I would have added, and again, there's more suggestions in that video, let's talk about the things that they did add. So when the game first came out, right away, as I said earlier, there was no co-op for the first time in a Halo game, or at least a mainstream Halo game, at all. This doesn't just include split screen, which, by the way, still isn't in the game, but also online co-op. None of it was there, and it took almost a year for them to actually get it in. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Was that a good thing that they eventually added it? For the most part, the answer to that question is yes. I'm glad I get to play with my friends now, and that's something that means a lot. They also added Forge. I don't know if it's the Forge beta or the full release, but I've already seen a lot of astounding creations from the Halo Forge community. They should be very proud of themselves. I certainly don't have that gift. And I know that the Forge that is in Halo Infinite is the most advanced Forge that we've seen so far. It's a bit over my head, but for those of you who can navigate it and create something spectacular from it, I commend you. Thank you for your work. I immensely appreciate you. So those are things that were added along with Mission Replay. And those, and so again, Mission Replay was not available from the start. It is now. Again, is that a good thing? The answer is ultimately yes, just not the way I would have done it. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later too. So we're going to jump into this in terms of one of my main praises in my original review was the open world concept of Halo Infinite. As I said then, the semi-open world concept in ODST worked perfectly, so it's no surprise that it worked in Halo Infinite. And that's something that I really did praise. That was the main linchpin in terms of what I felt like made Halo Infinite, in its current state, an excellent foundation. Here's the problem. Going back on this game on Legendary, I realized something. This game has 15 playable missions, which I already knew, but only 4 of them, really only 4 of them, take place in the open world environment. Those missions are the Tower/Recovery, because I guess they couldn't decide which name they wanted to choose with that one, so they went with both. There's Excavation Site, there's Pelican Down, and there's also the Sequence, and that's it. There are 2 other missions that take place outside. There's Outpost Tremonius, which is a very small, closed-in mission, considering that it does take place outside technically. And there's also The Road, which is also linear, although you do get a Scorpion tank, so I'll give credit where credit is due. But that's 4 out of 15 missions. And while those 4 missions do allow you to explore, they have a lot of additional side objectives. You have high-value targets you can take out. You can capture FOMs. There are a few side missions in there, like Ransom Keep. There are items you can collect. There are skulls, obviously. There's a lot of stuff there. And theoretically, you could still spend a lot of time in the open world. How much time compared to the linear missions, I don't know. I haven't measured it. Maybe some of you have. But if you're just going through the campaign normally, you spend less than a third of the game in the open world. The rest of it is set in linear environments, most of them interior. And so, to that end, yes, it did lay an excellent foundation, but even in the core campaign, it did not take full advantage of it. And so, this sort of, to springboard off of this kind of goes into the linear missions of the game, and I wanted to talk about those more as well. Recently, I posted my Halo Infinite Legendary walkthrough for the mission, the Nexus, or just Nexus, I think it's called. And I'm not going to lie, I was both bored and frustrated at the same time. You go through each of these rooms, and most of them are very symmetrical and very repetitive. Essentially, you hold back at the entrance for the most part, depending on how you play. That might be up to you. And you just systematically take out enemies, and from there you either clear the room and move forward, or you put the power seed in and move forward, or whatever it is, and then you're met with another room. And then you repeat the process. And that might be fun at first, but it does get old after a while, and there are a lot of those in this game. The first two missions alone, the first one, Warship Gabrakan, and then the follow-up Foundation, are both linear missions. Now, in previous games, it's not uncommon for a Halo game to start out with a linear mission, and then maybe in mission 2 it usually gets you more involved in the open world. Not always, but usually it does. In this mission, or in this game, the first two missions are both very linear, and I can forgive Warship Gabrakan to a point, because we've had 3 other Halo games, let me count, 3 other Halo games where you start out in some sort of a spacecraft. And so that's almost tradition at this point. But then it usually opens up, actually with all 3 Halo games that I'm referencing here, Halo Combat Evolved, Halo 2, and Halo 4, it does, in the following mission, give you access to a more open environment. The follow-up mission here is Foundation, and it's an annoying one for me. It's one of the hardest ones in the game, in my personal opinion, just because of the layout of the mission itself. The fact that it's long, and it also ends with a boss, and a very, not difficult boss, just a very tedious one. I wasn't really a huge fan of Tremonius. There are also a lot of places where you can fall to your death in that mission, which was also very annoying. Nexus also shares that, which I'll get to in a bit. But what I noticed with that is the missions felt very repetitive after a while. They lacked a lot of variation. And because that takes up most of the game, that had an impact on the longevity of it. Again, I can go back to the open world missions and get a fair amount of replay value from it, but not the linear ones. I just can't. There's not a lot there. The scenarios keep playing out the same. And if I compared that to a lot of previous Halo games, including the 343 ones, that's not the case. So I'm not really sure what happened here, if they were sort of running out of ideas, but it didn't work well. And so to sort of go off of that, I want to sort of return to co-op for a second here, and I'll come back to the campaign missions here in a minute. But as much as I wanted co-op, and I'm as glad as I am that it's currently in the game, I realized that the majority of this game is not built for 4-player co-op. And I'll start with this. It works best for the open world missions, absolutely, but even the implementation there could have been done better. The way it works now is, and just to give you an example here, if you stray too far from your team, then the game kills you, and then you spawn somewhere near your teammates. Why couldn't it just teleport you to them? Because if it kills you, then you lose your weapons. And if you had a special weapon like the Arcane Sentinel Beam, or a special battle rifle or energy sword, then the only way to get that back is one of 2 ways. Either you and your squad have to go back to your body so you can pick them up, or you all have to fast travel to the closest fob so you can get them again. So that just kind of makes all of you have to go out of your way for something that could have been done with a very simple mechanic fix. It's a minor gripe for the open world co-op, to be honest with you. But the linear missions are a bit different, because the linear missions aren't just linear, but they are very much closed in compared to what I've seen in previous Halo games. And again, that includes Halo 5 Guardians. A few weeks ago, I was playing through the campaign with a few friends of mine, and because the linear missions are so tightly constricted, especially when I look at missions like Foundation and Conservatory and Nexus, because they're so narrow, we ended up killing each other quite a bit. So if you're going through these missions with 3 other people, and if any of you have heavy weapons, or you're not careful and you throw a grenade at the wrong place, you may end up killing your teammates because there's just not enough room for 4 players to comfortably combat the scenario. Now, to draw a comparison, Halo 5, the missions were still technically linear, but if I look at a mission like Blue Team, which is the second mission in Halo 5, even though it's mostly linear and straightforward, the areas themselves are very wide. There's a lot of places for you and your squad to spread out and do some real damage without your actions affecting the other players in a negative way. And Halo Infinite does not have that. Again, it's very closed in for most of the game, so don't be surprised if you have a rocket launcher and you shoot it at a high-ranking elite or brute or whatever, and one of your allies is going up trying to get a close-range shot with a CQB weapon, and all of a sudden you take them both out at the same time. That kind of bites. But unfortunately, it's a feature. So I feel like even though I'm glad campaign co-op is now finally in, the game really wasn't built well for co-op. And maybe that's part of the reason it wasn't included at launch. But that could have been done much better. And it could have even been resolved adding in campaign DLC with far better constructed missions that were more equipped to handle that kind of combat scenario. Again, Halo 5 by comparison had much roomier missions that you could explore. Again, Blue Team's a great example. Swords of St. Helios, Battle of Sinayon, the final mission, Guardians. I mean, all these missions, even though they felt linear in a lot of places, offered you room to explore. Halo Infinite just does not do that. Most of the game is very constricted. And so that did sort of change my wavelength in terms of how I felt about how these missions played out. And to sort of go back to the mission design itself, when I was going through Nexus, one thing that really took me off guard here was the simple fact that they added a gondola ride to it. I'm not sure who play tested that part, but oh my gosh, did that piss me off. The last time we saw a gondola like that was in Halo 2. I didn't enjoy those segments. I don't know how many of you did, but back then you had drones and Ranger elites surrounding you. But even then, you had more cover than you do in Halo Infinite. You have basically your platform, and you can barely hide from the swarms of sentinels that attack you. If you look at my legendary walkthrough, the only sound way I could get through that was by grappling onto the support beam beneath it and basically bypassing the sentinels and then one-offing them with a scorpion gun towards the end of the mission. That was my most efficient way of doing that. So again, I'm not sure who play tested that, but wow, that was tedious. We're talking about the enemies for a second here with the sentinels and whatnot. I do want to sort of backtrack a little bit and talk about the enemies some more, because this does filter into the more constricted environments. One of my biggest gripes with Halo 2, because again, you saw at the bottom of my list, was the Halo 2 Jackal Sniper and how overpowered that was. And in general, I don't like sniper enemies in Halo games. It takes away from what I enjoyed about Combat Evolved so much. And they did seem to dial that back in later titles, to a point at least. In Halo Infinite, while the Jackal snipers technically don't have beam rifles, they have stalker rifles, they can still do quite a bit of damage. And in a lot of areas where there are Jackal snipers in Halo Infinite, they usually show up in multiples, at least in a pair, so they can tag team you pretty easily. But on top of that, the stalker rifle is not the only sniper weapon that your enemies have access to. They also have access to the shock rifle, as well as the, the skewer, which is even more powerful than both of those. So you can get sniped left and right depending on how many enemies in the area actually have access to those weapons. And it only further constricts the game, just like some of the missions did in Halo 2. So that really kind of takes me back in terms of campaign, just because I like the ability to explore and try different scenarios using different tactics. But when you have snipers like that, particularly that many variants, it does constrict your gameplay and how you can tackle each individual area. So I did want to touch on that a little bit. And so going back to things that were added, one thing that I wanted to touch on that I didn't go into complete detail about was replayable missions. It was something that I wanted ever since Halo Infinite was released. We only heard about it, I think, maybe a few days before the game launched, that replayable missions weren't going to be a thing right away. And that was a real interesting thing. Once again, just like with Combat Evolved, we have not seen that in a Halo game before. So now both co-op and replayable missions aren't a thing at launch, but had to be implemented later. Again, I'm glad they were implemented, but the way it was done, I'm not sure I would have done it in that manner. Right now, if you want to replay a mission, instead of going to a menu and just selecting the mission and going from there, you have to go into the TAC map. And from there, you can select the mission. And there are a few things I noticed about this, and one of my colleagues picked up on it too. If you are in a later mission of the game, let's just say you're in the sequence, and you've collected all the Spartan cores the game has to offer at that point. And maybe you have the Scorpion gun too from Outpost Tremonius. Maybe you've carried that all the way with you up until this point. If you go back and you select the first mission, Mission Gabrakan, you now have all Spartan cores upgraded. You now have access to the Scorpion gun and the bandana skull on top of that, which also gives you access to infinite grenades, including the shock grenade, aka the dynamo grenade. So you can go through the first half of this game, more than that actually, the first 9 missions with fully upgraded Spartan cores, the Scorpion gun, even before you're supposed to get it, and the bandana skull, which makes you so overpowered. And I know that I'm doing my legendary walkthrough with the Scorpion gun, but keep in mind, I am currently using it as a back pocket weapon, and I did promise to follow up with a 2.0 walkthrough without the Scorpion gun, and I will follow through on that promise. Or at least I plan to. But the fact that you can start on a mission 1 with making yourself completely unstoppable really detracts something from the game. There's a reason I didn't redo my top 25 hardest Halo missions. Maybe I'll put that in the description below as well, a link to it, include Halo Infinite missions, and because there's no point. You know, the game is so all over the place with what you can do for each mission, I can't really pinpoint what can classify as a difficult mission anymore. Mythic/Lazo was a complete joke now, because you can go through the entire campaign with fully upgraded Spartan cores and the Scorpion gun and bandana on. It's now trivial now. It doesn't matter. So replayable missions did that in that regard. But on top of that, I also noticed that because there's no manual save feature, if you decide to quit out of a mission that you're replaying from earlier, if you decide to load up the game later, it's not going to take you back to that spot. It's going to take you back to the most recent point you're at the game, or at least in the open world, one of the two. It will not take you back to that mission. So let's just say you're trying to practice a segment in one of the missions that you're replaying. You can't go back to that spot unless you replay the mission up until that point. You have to basically start where you were and then select that mission and go through again. And this is sort of one of the other gripes that I have with the game that is attached to this, by the way, is that you can't manual save. You can't save and quit like you usually could. You have 4 save slots, and the game sort of picks and chooses when it saves for you, which I think sucks, personally. I would love, especially if, let's just say you go through the campaign once and, you get past the Harbinger, you're at that last portion of the game where you can explore again if you want to. I would love to have a situation where you could have that as one save, so you could go back and replay any of the missions with all the Spartan cores if you want to, but be able to also manual save if you want to start a new game from scratch. And maybe it's to show a cool concept, maybe it's to show some of those missions, maybe it's for content creation, whatever your reason might be, to have 2 separate games going on, but at your leisure, at your choice. And you can't do that here. The game decides that for you. You have no option. So that really needs to change as well. I would love to see a manual save option so that you can choose to save where you want to. So if you want to replay a certain segment in the campaign as much as you want, you can do that. And I've been doing that since Combat Evolved. I used to go to the Silent Cartographer all the time and just grenade my allies, because why not? I can essentially restart at the last checkpoint, even if I've quit out of the game earlier, and just pretend I never did that and continue with the mission. You can't do that here. So again, it's one thing that I would love to see change, that they should be able to do here. But the save feature has been kind of definitely not the best, to put it lightly, since the game was launched. That could definitely be worked on as well, but that plays into replayable missions. Sort of one other thing I wanted to add here before we start going into the tail end of this video is the story itself. And one thing that I mentioned in my initial review is that I actually do like the story, and that does hold true. That has not changed. I don't like it as much as Halo 4, which I also said in my initial review, but I do like it a lot more than Halo 5, which I still consider to have one of the weakest stories in the entire Halo franchise. Having said that, when I was going back through these missions, part of the reason I felt bored is because Halo Infinite lacks something that both Halo 4 and Halo 5 had, at least in my opinion. And this is going to be one of the few times you're going to hear me give a kudos to something Halo 5 did right in terms of its story. Referencing back to my initial Halo 5 video, and no, I'm not going to post a review for that here, or a link to that here, no point now, but I do stand by one of my statements there, is that in Halo 5, when you get to the end of the game, your characters really didn't feel like they accomplished anything. In terms of your end point in Halo 5 would not have changed if Master Chief and Locke had never got involved. If Blue Team and Fireteam Osiris had just stayed at home and watched YouTube, the outcome wouldn't have been any different. I still stand by that, but that, along with Halo 4, did something that Infinite did not. And that's, as the game progressed, it gave you a sense of urgency. That if you didn't keep moving forward, you didn't keep accomplishing the next objective, something terrible was going to happen. That is not the case in Halo Infinite. It does sort of tell you that, well, if we don't win here, the Banished are going to wipe out everybody. It tells you, it doesn't show you, it doesn't make you feel it. When I'm going through Halo 4 and Halo 5, both the way it demonstrates the enemies and what they can do, sometimes it's done in cutscenes, sometimes it's done with the action, sometimes it's done with the soundtrack. It makes you feel like you're working towards something. And so I have to give it credit for that. This is done with both Halo 4 and Halo 5. In Halo Infinite, I feel like they dialed that back tremendously. There's at no point in time where I feel like there is a huge sense of urgency. It's almost as if sometimes the characters are very nonchalant. Like, especially the weapon in particular. You know, when I'm playing the mission, the Command Spire, and at this point the weapon's pissed off at the Master Chief, which I have to segue on that just a little bit, but not quite yet, just to continue on here. She's pointing up, says, all right, the only way up, or only way to keep going is up. Let's get this over with. As if she already knows the outcome. Like, there's no sense of urgency. There's no threat here at all. She already knows the Master Chief's going to win. What's the danger? What's the danger to your protagonist here? It doesn't feel like there's any. You're just kind of moseying along, completing the objectives as they come, taking them as you get them, and that's it. They tell you that the Banished is dangerous, but they never really display that. You get a nice cutscene at the very beginning of the game with the Infinity under attack, and a little bit on the inside where Atriox KOs the Master Chief. But this all takes place in a matter of seconds. After that, it just kind of feels like characters are taking their time, and just to kind of reiterate, there's no sense of urgency here. And the weapon, just loop back a second, makes this even more interesting, and not necessarily in a good way. One of the lines that she says, one of the emotions that she comes across here, is that she's upset that the Master Chief tried to delete her in the mission Nexus, or the end of the mission, and she carries that chip on her shoulder throughout the next mission as well. which I find absolutely both stunning and hilarious, but not necessarily in the best way, because in the second mission, when she's first introduced, she is insisting that the Master Chief delete her. Now, all of a sudden, she's angry about it. So, some plot inconsistency there, or at least inconsistency in character development. So, again, that took me off guard. It was a bit of a turnoff in the character development area, as well as the way the story was progressing. So, going back, I still stand by the statement that, yes, I think Halo Infinite's story is better than Halo 5's, but it's not like it really had a lot of competition there to begin with, aside from the urgency department, but still not as good as Halo 4's. And it could have done a lot better, and Halo Infinite Campaign DLC could have helped flush that out even more and made it more enjoyable, given that sense of urgency, made it feel like what you were doing was important. I didn't feel that with Halo Infinite's campaign or its story. It was what it was. It felt just a little bit mundane, like they tried to play it safe too much. They dialed it back too much. So again, story's never been a huge thing with me. Again, I do enjoy Halo 5 overall. You saw that in the Halo rankings list. Even though I thought the story was terrible, I still appreciated the gameplay, and at least in my eyes, I know that that's not the same with all of you, but in my eyes, that's more important in a video game than the actual story. If the story is great, awesome. That's icing on the cake. Not necessary as long as the gameplay is fun. And for the most part, Halo Infinite still has that, but only in certain parts of the game. Not enough of it. And so that sort of brings me to where it now falls on my ranking list. Again, you saw how I ranked it earlier. It was number 2 on my list, right after Halo 3 and Halo 3 ODST, which I always rank together. So did it go up? Did it go down? Did it stay the same? Well, after what you heard me say over the course of more than 30 minutes now, this actually surpassed my Halo 2 review. Wow. I think you know that it definitely did not go up. It did not surpass Halo 3. And it does not stay the same either. I can't do that. Even though I bumped it up above Halo Combat Evolved back then because I figured, okay, it does have technically more features, and it does lay an excellent foundation. The thing of it is, Halo Combat Evolved, every single mission felt far more memorable. And I love going back, even to this day, even though the game's over 20 years old now, going back and playing those missions individually. I get so much more out of it. Halo Infinite's missions aren't nearly as memorable. I still get a lot of them mixed up, especially when you get towards the end of the game, and you have all those linear missions. You get a few open world missions, and then you get 6 linear missions in a row. 3 of those in a row were completely interior. I couldn't even tell them apart at first. And so they aren't memorable in the same way that they are for Halo Combat Evolved. Even though Combat Evolved didn't have quite as much at launch to enjoy in terms of variety for the entire game as a whole. You know, it didn't have online multiplayer at the time. It does now with Halo Anniversary. It didn't have online co-op. It does now with Halo Anniversary. I still got a lot more enjoyment out of the game and a lot more memories that stuck. I can recite all those missions for you and most of the dialogue and individual scenarios in that game. And so I have to give it its number 2 spot back. It's earned it. So, again, does that mean Halo Infinite's number 3? Still no. I have to dial it down even further. And do you know why? Because even years after Halo 5 came out, and keep in mind that there was a 6-year gap between Halo 5 and Halo Infinite, I still enjoyed it. Even if I didn't go back and play the campaign as much, the multiplayer was fantastic. I loved playing Warzone Firefight with my teammates. I loved a lot of aspects about multiplayer. It did it right. They added a lot of great stuff over time. And now that Halo Infinite is 15 months old, and it's lacking a lot of those things, I just don't go back and play it as much. I've forgotten a lot about it, and the shame of it is, there's a lot of things that they could add. And so I'm going to go ahead, and before I actually put my final ranking on this list, I'm just going to go ahead and pitch one more thing that I would suggest to Microsoft here, because I'm still going to put this in pending status for now. Now that Microsoft has acquired Blizzard, in that suggestion video that I put a link to in the description below that I mentioned earlier, I had noted a lot of things they could continue to add, including campaign DLC. including Warzone Firefight, including Standard Firefight, a lot of PvE stuff. There are some PvP modes that I pitched in that video as well, like Griffball and Infection. There's still a lot of room for them to continue to improve, and I hope they do. A lot of those suggestions were from, or were at least inspired by, World of Warcraft. And now that they technically own World of Warcraft, they can take some liberties from that game and add them into Halo Infinite. Give players a reason to come back week after week. Put those challenges in there. Put some invasion mode scenarios into the campaign. Add those additional enemy factions. Add some weekly achievements. Put some unlocks in there. People can get exclusive armor from that, exclusive achievements. I would love to see that rather than this, you got to pay for the Spartan Core stuff. There are so many ways this game can still improve. Will they? It's hard to say. Halo 5 had already come a long way at this stage of its game, in its life cycle. We haven't seen any of these types of announcements for Halo Infinite. So I don't know if they've given up on the game entirely, or if they're going to at least try in the future. Season 3 just hit recently, and I know we've seen some positive feedback from that. But is it enough to keep players coming back? I don't know. I haven't really messed with Season 3 yet. So those of you who have, I'd love to hear your feedback on it. I'd love to hear your feedback on what you think the future of Halo Infinite is. Because right now, Halo 5 is ranking right above Halo Infinite for me. That's right. Where is it on my rankings list right now? Between Halo 4 and Halo 5. It's now 4th from the top. That's a long way from number 2. At least from where it was. I've never demoted a Halo game before. Not once in my Halo rankings list. So, the only thing I have left to say is I still think there's hope for it. I still stand by the fact that I think it laid a great foundation. They just need to take advantage of it. I still enjoy the gameplay. There's just not enough there for me to keep coming back. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I know this, I hope this video didn't bring you down too much. It's just very weird for me to pivot on a Halo game this much, if at all. But I really would love to hear your thoughts on the current state of Halo Infinite. What do you think of my suggestions? Where would you like to see the game go? Would you like to see them continue to expand on it in the ways that I've mentioned before, not just in this video, but in my suggestions video? Or is it better that they try to start with a new game entirely? I'm not sure that's a great suggestion, because what if the same thing happens to that one that happened to this one? I want to see this one get better. I want to see it at number 1. Will it get there? Time will tell. I don't know, but maybe you can offer your insight. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below, and I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your busy day to sit down and watch this video. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it and you want to see more content, I hope you consider liking this video and hitting that subscribe button so you can see more content right here on the channel. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have an absolutely wonderful weekend. I'll catch you all right back here next time. And as always, I'm the Tyrant, signing off.